What's going on, guys? Dr. Stephen Meyer, a scientist and a proponent of intelligent design, went on the Joe Rogan Podcast and provided some of the best and most sound arguments for the existence of God that I've ever heard in long form. And it was amazing. And in many other instances, Joe Rogan was left speechless and he had to just go to a different topic. So I cannot wait to show you some of the highlights of this conversation and provide some of my thoughts and just kind of break it down in layman's terms, because this guy is brilliant, and I think Joe Rogan was out of his league. Let's get right to it.
The thing that really convinced me as a university student studying philosophy was an argument known as the argument from epistemological necessity. The fundamental question in modern philosophy that has really just been a stumper and has led to this whole postmodern turn where people don't think there's no objective basis for any reality is the question of the reliability of the human mind. On what basis can we trust the way our minds process all that sensory information? This goes back to Hume and Kant and some of the philosophers in the Enlightenment period. And from that point forward, there was a great doubt. Maybe we can't trust our minds. Maybe we can't trust. We have all these things we assume about reality in order to make sense about reality. That every cause has an effect, for example. But we can't prove those things. We have to use those assumptions in order to know anything at all. And I encountered this argument that suggested, well, if we try to justify our ability to know the world around us by empirical data, by things we observe, this was Hume's argument. You can't do it. He was a radical empiricist and found that in order to make any sense of the sense impressions he had to presuppose the uniformity of nature. But to prove the uniformity of nature, he had to make reference to sensory observations, and so he was arguing in a circle. And so it came down, you couldn't justify the reliability of assumptions we make in our minds by observing the world. You had to use those assumptions to make sense of the observations. But if you presupposed that our minds were made by a benevolent creator who gave us those assumptions in order to make sense of the world that he also made, then there was a principle of correspondence between the way the mind worked and the way the world worked, in which case we could trust the basic reliability of the mind. And this turns out to be one of the key foundational assumptions that gave rise to modern science. It was called the idea of intelligibility. Newton, Boyle, Kepler, the great founders of modern science, thought that nature had secrets to reveal. There were patterns there to be revealed that we could understand because our minds had been made in the image of the same rational creator who had built rationality and design and pattern and lawful order into the world.
Do you believe in evolution?
Joe Rogan didn't even try to respond because there is no response. I love how Stephen Meyer exposed the presupposition of the atheist. They talk about science and the scientific method and observations, but in order to even get to that point, you have to assume that science and the laws of nature are uniform, and you have to use your senses to judge and test those things. However, you also have to assume that your senses are working reliable based on the things that you're testing. It's circular reasoning. It's an infinite regress. Doesn't it stand to reason that a big bang will produce chaos, not order, randomness, not laws? See, the uniformity of nature requires a precondition of intelligibility, a rational mind, a rational God, and God, who is rational, created rational beings to live in his universe, and he provided tools such as math and logic and morality and physics to better understand the universe that he created. So atheists say, well, you're presupposing God. Well, it's much more rational to presuppose God as a precondition versus reasoning in a circle. Joe Rogan had no response to any of that.
I believe in I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor. I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell. And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I attended a conference in 2016 at convened by the Royal Society in London, Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks. And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the 5 major what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, the Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So modification, yes. Innovation, no.
But modification over massive amounts of time.
Here's another fail on Joe Rogan's part. His only response to that dilemma presented by Stephen Meyer was, well, time. Microevolution over a long period of time can turn a fish into a bear, turn a primordial soup of chemicals into an amphibian. In other words, it's never been observed, it's not scientific, and we don't have a clue. It's not possible. Chemicals can't turn themselves into cells, but let's just, for the sake of the conversation, say they could. It still doesn't explain where the chemicals came from in the first place. It still doesn't explain the origin of life.
Don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well, time,
like primates.
Time was always the hero of the plot. But let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think. Okay, and I developed these in a lot of detail in my book Darwin's Doubt. If we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types, new types. So if you got animals that first come on the line and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings of A's, C's, G's, and T's, not zeros and ones, but A's, C's, G's, and T's in a digital string, and we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system.
In layman's terms, evolution is the opposite of progress. Changes over time degrades an organism. It doesn't improve it. When you constantly change an organism, change it, you're not going to get a better organism. They've done this experiment on fruit flies. They've changed them and tweaked the DNA, and the next batch always came out worse than before or the same. Nothing was better or improved. Nothing new was added. It was always the same or worse. So how can we say evolution over time changes can compound and create new and better organisms? It doesn't happen in nature. It doesn't happen in the lab. Evolution cannot explain the diversity of life, the variety of life. It doesn't explain the origin of life. It doesn't help explain anything. It has no explanatory power except microevolution, which is true. Speciation, adaptation, these things are embedded in the cell by an intelligent mind. God is programming the cells to do certain things and function in certain ways in certain environments. That is from the mind of God. That is not through some random process that randomly happened. It doesn't work. Stephen Meyer is just providing Joe Rogan so many valid reasons to believe in God, and showing him that his belief, the atheist worldview, it has no explanatory power for the origin of life, for their presuppositions and why they believe the universe functions the way it does. And I'm grateful that Joe Rogan was in the presence of Stephen Meyer. So now he truly has all of the evidence he needs. I'm grateful for Stephen Meyer. Grateful that he's using his intelligence to simplify very complex things so people can understand them and they can see the glory of God, the majesty of God, and the power of God through creation, through the cells. All these things are powerful examples of the fingerprint of God. I love it. If you enjoyed this video and you want more content like this, do me a favor and subscribe to the channel and like this particular video right here. I'll be back next week with another one. This is Pastor Frederick. This is about a book. Peace.